Questions about your genes or your DNA, let's find the answers. Ask a genetic counselor.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Ask a Genetic Counselor, the podcast where your genetics questions shape the conversation. I'm your host, licensed genetic counselor Sam Geere. Today's questions are all centered around genetics and hearing. Hearing loss is a medical term used to describe a partial or complete reduction in hearing. Hearing difference is a broader term that can describe hearing that differs from what's considered a typical hearing range. You'll also hear me use lowercase deaf, capital D deaf, and hard of hearing. Lowercase deaf can be used to describe a person's hearing status, while capital D deaf refers to an identity connected with deaf culture and community. Hard of hearing generally describes someone with some degree of hearing loss and can also be an identity a person uses for themselves. You may also hear me use the abbreviation DHH, which stands for deaf and hard of hearing and is often used as a broader umbrella term. Language and identity are personal, so not everyone will use these terms in exactly the same way. So throughout this episode, I'll use different terms depending on the context of the question we're discussing. All right, let's get into our first question. So our first question says, "Hello, my 9-month-old daughter has severe hearing loss. Doctors stated that the GJB2 gene is the cause. Is there a treatment for this gene?" Thank you so much for sending this question. And there are actually two different questions wrapped up in here that I think are worth separating. The first, what does it mean that GJB2 is causing my daughter's hearing loss? And then the second is the question you're really asking. Is there anything we can do about it? So let's start with the genetics. GJB2 is actually one of the most common genes associated with inherited hearing loss. The gene provides instructions for making a protein called connexin 26. Connexin 26 is important in the inner ear. I'm going to simplify the biology a bit here because we could probably spend an entire podcast talking about how the cochlea works, but essentially, inside the inner ear is a really specialized environment that has to be maintained very carefully for hearing to work properly. Connexin 26 forms channels between cells, and those channels help cells communicate and help maintain the movement and recycling of certain charged particles, particularly potassium ions, which are important for the hearing process. So, if someone has certain changes or variants in both copies of GJB2, that interferes with how connexin 26 functions, and that can disrupt this system, resulting in sensorineural hearing loss. And here's where I want to explain something that can be confusing when a parent first gets a genetic result. Most of us have two copies of GJB2, one from each of our parents. And the most common form of GJB2 related non syndromic hearing loss follows something called autosomal recessive inheritance. And if you've listened to previous episodes, you've heard me talk about this before, but I never want to assume that anyone here has heard every episode. So, very briefly, with an autosomal recessive condition, a person generally needs to inherit a disease causing change in both copies of the gene in order to have the condition. That means it's very possible for two parents who hear typically to have a child with GJB2 related hearing loss. Each parent may have one working copy of GJB2 and one altered copy, and they're what we call carriers. Because their working copy is generally enough for the gene to do its job, carriers of the typical autosomal recessive form usually don't have GJB2 related hearing loss themselves. Then, when two carriers have a child together, there are several possible combinations. The child could inherit both working copies, they could inherit one working copy and one altered copy and be a carrier like their parents, or they could inherit the altered copy from each parent. In that last situation, the child would have two disease causing variants and could have GJB2 related hearing loss. And that can be really surprising for families. A genetic condition does not have to be visibly traveling through a generation or many generations of a family for it to be inherited. You could have two hearing parents, four hearing grandparents, no siblings who are deaf or hard of hearing, and still have a child with a genetic form of hearing loss. So, when a family tells me, but nobody else in our family has hearing loss, that doesn't necessarily argue against a genetic explanation. With recessive conditions in particular, sometimes the first person we see with the condition is a child born to two completely healthy carriers. Now, I do want to put a small asterisk next to everything I just said. There are different variants in GJB2, and there are also less common dominantly inherited forms of GJB2 related hearing loss. So, when I'm talking about recessive inheritance here, I'm describing the most common form of GJB2 related non syndromic hearing loss. For an individual family, we would actually want to look at the exact variants that were identified on the child's genetic test before making conclusions about inheritance or recurrence chances. And that's one of those places where genetic counseling can be really helpful. Now, let's talk about another word I just used, non syndromic. When geneticists describe hearing loss as non syndromic, we're basically saying that the hearing difference is occurring without a recognizable pattern of other medical findings caused by that same genetic condition. So, with the typical autosomal recessive form of GJB2 related hearing loss, we aren't generally expecting, for example, hearing loss plus a characteristic heart problem, plus a vision problem, plus a kidney problem. The hearing difference itself is the primary feature. That's going to become important later in today's episode because we're also going to talk about conditions where hearing differences can occur as part of a broader genetic condition. And that's one reason finding a genetic explanation can sometimes be useful. It isn't necessarily just about putting a name on something. Sometimes it's helping us answer, is hearing the primary thing we need to be thinking about? Or does this genetic result tell us that there may be other parts of someone's health that need attention too? And sometimes the answer is reassuring. A result can help explain why someone has a hearing difference without pointing us toward a whole list of additional medical concerns. Now let's get to the parent's actual question. Is there a treatment for the GJB2 gene? And I want to be really precise here because this is an area where the science is changing very quickly. At this time, there is not an approved gene therapy that corrects or replaces GJB2 as a standard treatment for GJB2 related hearing loss. But research into gene therapy for genetic forms of hearing loss is happening, including research specifically involving GJB2. When we say genetic hearing loss, we're actually talking about many different genetic causes. A treatment developed for hearing loss caused by one gene doesn't automatically work for hearing loss caused by another gene. And this is where knowing the genetic cause can become increasingly relevant. If someone has hearing loss caused by GJB2, a therapy designed around a completely different gene wouldn't necessarily address what's happening in their inner ear. The treatment has to match the biology. There is currently early clinical research investigating gene therapy specifically for GJB2 related hearing loss. And I want to emphasize early research. When something enters a clinical trial, that doesn't mean we know that it works. It doesn't mean we know that it's going to become an approved treatment, and it certainly doesn't mean that every person with a change in that gene would qualify to receive it. Clinical trials have very specific eligibility criteria that can include someone's age, their exact genetic variants, the type and degree of hearing loss, previous interventions, other medical history, and many other factors. So even though the child in this question is 9 months old, I wouldn't want someone listening to this to hear about an early clinical trial and assume that means this particular individual would be eligible. That's something the family would need to discuss with their own healthcare team and, if appropriate, with the investigators conducting the study. But I do think it's worth knowing that this research exists, because if you had asked this exact question several years ago, the conversation about gene-directed treatment would have looked very different. And that's one of the fascinating and sometimes frustrating things about genetics. Our answer to, is there a treatment, can change as the science changes. Now, I also want to talk about the word treatment because I think there are several different questions a parent might be asking when they use that word. You might be asking, can we change the underlying gene cause? Or you might be asking, are there ways to give my child greater access to sound? Or maybe even, what can we do to support our child's communication and language development? Those are different questions. And even though there isn't currently approved therapy that changes the GJB2 gene itself, that doesn't mean there are no options available to a family. Depending on the individual child, their hearing, their development, and the family's goals, there may be conversations about hearing aids, cochlear implants, sign language, spoken language services, early intervention programs, deaf mentors, and community resources, or a combination of approaches. And this is where I think it's especially important that healthcare professionals give families information rather than assuming what their goals should be. Different families make different choices, and those choices don't necessarily have to fit neatly into one category or another. A child might use hearing technology and sign language. A family may choose to learn ASL, regardless of whether their child uses hearing aids or receives a cochlear implant. And what works for someone at one stage of life may change later. And that's very consistent with how I think about my role as a genetic counselor. My job isn't to decide what outcome you should want. My job is to help you understand what the genetic information means so that you can make informed decisions. And in this case, genetics can potentially tell this family quite a bit. It may explain why their daughter has severe hearing loss. It may help clarify whether we're expecting hearing loss to occur by itself or as part of a broader condition. It may tell us something about inheritance. It may have implications for other family members. And increasingly, knowing the exact genetic cause may also help families understand whether there are research studies or gene specific therapies being investigated that could potentially become relevant in the future. And I think that's where genetic counseling can really help bridge the gap between getting a laboratory report and understanding what that report actually means for your family. Now, there's one other piece of information I would want this family to discuss with their genetics team, and that's what this result could mean for future pregnancies and other family members. If this child has the typical autosomal recessive form of GJB2 related hearing loss, and both parents are carriers, then with each pregnancy, there would generally be a 25% chance of having a child who inherits both altered copies, a 50% chance of having a child who inherits one altered copy and is a carrier, and a 25% chance of having a child who inherits neither familial variant. And I always emphasize the words each pregnancy because probabilities don't remember what happened before. Having one child with GJB2 related hearing loss doesn't mean that the next 3 children won't have it. And having 3 children who don't inherit both variants doesn't mean the fourth one automatically will. The same probabilities apply independently with each pregnancy. And depending on the exact genetic result and the family's circumstances, there may also be reasons to discuss whether testing or hearing evaluation would be appropriate for siblings or other relatives. Again, that's something a genetic counselor can individualize based on the family's actual results, rather than applying a general rule to everyone with GJB2. So, if I could sit down with the parent who sent this question, I think the biggest thing I would want them to walk away understanding is this. Yes, GJB2 can absolutely be the explanation for severe hearing loss in a baby. At this time, we don't have an approved treatment that simply changes the GJB2 gene itself. There are, however, established options for supporting hearing access, communication, and language development, and there is early research investigating gene directed therapies for GJB2 related hearing loss. And you don't have to make every decision about your daughter's future today. At 9 months old, there are going to be a lot of conversations happening at once: audiology, ENT, early intervention, maybe genetics, maybe decisions about communication or hearing technology. And it's okay to gather information. It's okay to ask questions. And it's okay for those conversations to evolve as your daughter grows and as you learn more about what works best for her and your family. A genetic result can tell us something really important about why a hearing difference occurred, but it doesn't tell us everything about the person who carries it. And this brings us into our next question. Question 2 asks, my child was diagnosed with Pendred syndrome after genetic testing for hearing loss. I keep reading about thyroid problems, but their thyroid tests are normal. Does having Pendred syndrome mean they will eventually develop thyroid disease? This is such a good question because it gets at something that can be really confusing after genetic testing. Sometimes you go into genetic testing looking for an explanation for one thing, in this case, hearing loss, and you come out with information that suddenly seems to involve an entirely different part of the body. And that can be a lot. You may have spent months focusing on hearing tests, audiology appointments, maybe imaging, communication options, school or early intervention services, and then suddenly someone's talking about your child's thyroid. So let's unpack why those two things are connected, and also what a diagnosis like Pendred syndrome can and can't tell us about the future. Pendred syndrome is a genetic condition most commonly associated with changes in a gene called SLC26A4. Typically, we each have two copies of this gene, one inherited from each parent. Pendred syndrome is generally inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern, like I described in question 1. The SLC26A4 gene gives our bodies instructions for making a protein called pendrin, and pendrin isn't only important in the inner ear. It's also found in other parts of the body, including the thyroid, and that's why a genetic condition involving this one gene can potentially have effects that seem at first glance completely unrelated. And this is actually one of the reasons genetic testing for hearing loss can sometimes be useful beyond simply answering the question, why does my child have this hearing difference? Some types of hearing loss can be part of a broader medical picture, and genetic testing can sometimes identify health information that isn't apparent yet. Pendred syndrome is one example of that. Now, hearing differences associated with SLC26A4 can vary quite a bit from person to person. Some children are born with hearing loss, and others, the hearing difference may become apparent later. The degree can vary, and for some people, hearing can change or progress over time. There are also certain structural differences of the inner ear that are commonly associated with SLC26A4. One you may hear your child's medical team mention is an enlarged vestibular aqueduct, usually shortened to EVA. And here's another place where genetics gets a little more complicated than we sometimes expect. Not everyone with SLC26A4 related hearing loss necessarily has the exact same clinical picture. You may hear terms like Pendred syndrome as SLC26A4 related non-syndromic hearing loss or DFNB4. There can be overlap between these categories, which is one reason I would be cautious about taking somebody else's experience with an SLC26A4 diagnosis and assuming that your child's experience will be identical. So now let's get to the part you're specifically asking about, the thyroid. The thyroid is a small gland in the neck that produces hormones that are incredibly important for things like metabolism, growth, and development. One feature historically associated with Pendred syndrome is enlargement of the thyroid gland, which is called goiter. But, and this is the part I really want parents to hear, having a diagnosis of Pendred syndrome does not mean that your child is guaranteed to have an enlarged thyroid right now. And it doesn't mean that abnormal thyroid hormone levels are inevitable. A child can absolutely have Pendred syndrome and have normal thyroid testing. In fact, thyroid findings can develop later than the hearing differences. So if your child is young and their thyroid evaluation is normal, that doesn't somehow invalidate the genetic diagnosis. At the same time, the genetic diagnosis gives their healthcare team a reason to know that the thyroid is something worth keeping on their radar. And I think this distinction is really important whenever we're talking about genetics. Genetic information can sometimes tell us what to watch for, but it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what will happen. Those are two very different things. If somebody has a genetic condition associated with an increased chance of a particular health feature, it's really easy to hear that as this is going to happen to my child. But genetics frequently doesn't work with that level of certainty. Instead, sometimes the information allows us to say, we know people with this condition can develop this particular feature, so now your child's medical team can decide whether and how it makes sense to monitor for it. That's one of the potential benefits of reaching a genetic diagnosis. The goal is to understand whether there is information that might be relevant to that person's health care. Some forms of hearing loss can be part of a broader medical picture, and that genetic information may identify other health information. We are simply asking, is there information here that could be useful for this child? For a family with a Pendred syndrome diagnosis, thyroid health is one of those pieces of information. Exactly what monitoring your child needs, how often it should happen, and what testing is appropriate is something I would want you to discuss with the clinicians who actually know your child's medical history. Often they're pediatrician, endocrinologist, ENT, genetics team, or some combination of those providers. But I wouldn't interpret a normal thyroid test today as meaning the genetic result must be wrong. And I also wouldn't interpret the Pendred syndrome diagnosis as meaning my child is definitely going to develop serious thyroid disease. There's a lot of space between those two conclusions. And this brings us to something I think is particularly important for parents who are navigating genetic information. When we identify a genetic cause for something in a child, there can be this sudden temptation to look up every single feature associated with that condition. And I completely understand why. You finally have a name. So you type that name into Google, and suddenly you're reading lists of symptoms, complications, case reports, and experiences from other families. And before long, a genetic diagnosis can start to feel less like information about your child and more like a prediction of everything that's going to happen to them. But a list of features associated with a genetic condition isn't a checklist your child is destined to complete. Your child is still the same child they were before you received that test result. The diagnosis gives you another piece of information about them, potentially a very useful piece, but it doesn't replace everything you already know about who they are, and it doesn't give us a crystal ball. Genetic results cannot define a baby's future, and hearing status is only one part of who that child is. And I would extend that idea to the diagnosis itself. Pendred syndrome is something your child has. It's not the sum total of who your child is. There's another side to this question that I think is worth talking about too. For some families, learning about the thyroid association may actually make them feel better about having pursued genetic testing. Maybe their original question was simply, why does my child have hearing loss? But now the result has given their healthcare team information they can potentially use going forward. For another parent, learning about a possible future health concern may create anxiety that wasn't there before. They might think, I was only trying to understand my child's hearing. Now I've been given something else to worry about. Both reactions make sense. Genetic information doesn't affect every family in the same way. A result that brings relief to one family can be upsetting to another, and a healthcare professional shouldn't presume how someone is going to feel about receiving it. That's something genetic counselors spend a lot of time thinking about, because our job isn't just to tell you what SLC26A4 does, it's also to help you figure out what this information means for your family. And if you're listening to this because your child has recently received a Pendred syndrome diagnosis, one thing I would encourage you to do at your next genetics appointment is separate your questions into two categories. What do we know about my child right now? And what are we monitoring because of what we know about Pendred syndrome? Those questions can sound very similar, but psychologically, I think they can feel very different. Maybe your child's thyroid function is completely normal today. That's information about your child right now. Maybe their medical team recommends monitoring thyroid health as they grow because of the Pendred syndrome diagnosis. That's information about planning for the future. Monitoring something does not mean we're predicting that something bad is going to happen. It means we have information that may allow us to be more intentional about your child's care. And there's one final piece of this diagnosis that I wouldn't want to leave out: family implications. Because Pendred syndrome is generally inherited in an autosomal recessive manner, genetic testing may also raise questions about parents, siblings, future children, or other relatives. Parents may learn that they're carriers of an SLC26A4 variant without having Pendred syndrome themselves. Families may also have questions about whether siblings should be tested or what the diagnosis could mean for future pregnancies. Those conversations are very individualized because the answer depends on the exact genetic results and the family structure. Our job as genetic counselors is to discuss whether results might have implications for siblings and extended family while still allowing families to decide how and when they want to share that information. So, if you received a report that says something like pathogenic variants identified in SLC26A4, and you're trying to figure out what that means for everyone else in your family, that's a really appropriate reason to sit down with a genetic counselor and go through the actual report together. But coming back to your original question, no, having Pendred syndrome does not mean that an abnormal thyroid test today or thyroid disease in the future is guaranteed. What the diagnosis does is give your child's healthcare team information about an association they now know to consider. And I think that's one of the most helpful ways to think about genetic information in general. Sometimes genetics gives us an answer, sometimes it gives us something to monitor, sometimes it gives us probabilities rather than certainties, and sometimes it gives us information whose importance we won't fully understand until later. The goal isn't to predict every detail of your child's future. It's to understand your child as well as we can today and to use the information we have to help make thoughtful decisions as they grow. All right, let's move on to question 3. Question 3 states, my daughter has hearing loss and an enlarged vestibular aqueduct, but her genetic testing didn't find anything. Does that mean it isn't genetic? I also really like this question because I think there's a very understandable assumption that comes with genetic testing. You have the test comes back negative, so naturally you think, okay, I guess this isn't genetic. But a negative genetic test doesn't necessarily mean that. And this is one of those areas where the word negative can be a little misleading because it sounds much more definitive than it actually is. When a genetic test comes back negative, what we're really saying is the test did not identify a genetic change that explains what we're seeing. That's different from saying there's no genetic explanation. And enlarged vestibular aqueduct, or EVA, is actually a really useful example of why that distinction matters. First, let's talk about what EVA actually is. The vestibular aqueduct is a small bony canal in the inner ear. When that structure is larger than expected, it's called an enlarged vestibular aqueduct. EVA itself isn't a genetic diagnosis. It's an anatomical finding that can be seen on imaging, usually a CT or MRI, and people with EVA can have a really wide range of hearing. Some people have hearing loss from a young age. For others, it may be recognized later. Hearing can sometimes fluctuate or change over time. So, when a child has hearing loss and EVA, one of the questions that may come up is why? And that's where genetics may become part of the evaluation. We just talked about SLC26A4 in our last question because changes in that gene are associated with Pendred syndrome and with other forms of SLC26A4 related hearing loss. And EVA is one of the findings that can be associated with SLC26A4. So I think it's very reasonable for a parent to think, we tested the gene associated with these symptoms, and the test was negative. Now what? This is where I want to explain something about genetic testing that I think is incredibly important, not just for hearing loss, but really for genetic testing in general. A genetic test can only find what that particular test is capable of detecting. And that sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but I don't think we always explain that clearly enough before people have genetic testing. Sometimes people imagine genetic testing almost like we're taking a sample of DNA, reading absolutely everything in it, and then receiving a report that says either, yes, this is genetic, or no, this is not genetic. That's usually not what's happening. There are lots of different kinds of genetic tests. Maybe your child had testing of just one gene. Maybe they had a hearing loss panel that looked at dozens or even hundreds of genes. Maybe they had exome sequencing. Maybe they had genome sequencing. Those tests don't all look at the same things, and they don't all have the same limitations. Even within the same type of test, technology changes over time. So, one of the first things I would want to know if I were talking with this family in a genetics appointment is what testing was actually done. Not just, was genetic testing negative? I would also want to see that report, which genes were included, was SLC26A4 included, what types of genetic changes was the laboratory able to detect, when was the testing performed, were there any variants of uncertain significance reported, was testing done only on the child, or were the parents tested too? Because all of those details can change how we interpret the result. And this is actually something I wish more people knew about genetic counseling. A big part of what we do isn't simply ordering genetic tests, it's figuring out what a genetic test actually means in the context of a person sitting in front of us. We're sort of like detectives. A negative result in someone without a strong indication of genetic condition may mean something very different from a negative result in someone whose medical history strongly suggests that genetics could be involved. The test result is one piece of evidence. It doesn't erase everything else we know about that person. Testing may identify a genetic explanation, but it may also produce an uncertain result or no answer at all. And importantly, a negative result does not necessarily rule out a genetic cause. So, why might we not find an answer? There are several possibilities. One is simply that our scientific knowledge is still incomplete. We know a lot about genes associated with hearing, and that list has grown tremendously, but we don't know everything. There may be genes associated with hearing that haven't been discovered yet. There may be relationships between genes and hearing that we're only beginning to understand. And there may be genetic changes that we know exist, but that current testing has difficulty identifying or interpreting. That's something I think can be really frustrating for families because genetic testing feels incredibly advanced. And it is, but advanced doesn't mean complete. We're still learning. Another possibility is that the genetic change is somewhere the particular test didn't adequately evaluate. DNA is enormous, and depending on the test, we may be focusing primarily on certain portions of genes where we currently know disease causing changes are most likely to occur. There can also be types of genetic variation that are easier for some technologies to detect than others. That's why my next question when a person says, I had a negative result, is always, what type of genetic testing was done? I like to see the report because those details matter. And then there's another possibility. There may genuinely not be a single identifiable genetic explanation for that person's hearing loss in EVA. Not every hearing difference is caused by one identifiable gene. There are both genetic and non genetic contributors to hearing differences, including things like congenital infections, prematurity, medications, and other environmental or medical factors. Sometimes the answer may be multifactorial. Sometimes we simply don't know. And I think that last answer can be one of the hardest ones to receive. Because if you've gone through all of these appointments hoping for an explanation, you probably weren't hoping for, we don't know yet. You wanted an answer. Maybe you wanted to know whether this could happen again in another child. Maybe you wanted to know whether other family members should have their hearing evaluated. Maybe you're wondering if your child could pass this on someday. Maybe you're wondering whether there are other health concerns you should be watching for. Those are very reasonable questions, and sometimes a negative genetic result means we can't answer all of them as precisely as we would like. This is where genetic counseling becomes especially important, because we don't need a positive genetic test to have a useful genetics conversation. Let's say your daughter's test doesn't identify a cause. I can still look at the family history. Is anyone else in the family deaf or hard of hearing? If so, when was their hearing difference identified? Is there EVA in anyone else? Are there relatives with thyroid findings? Are there other medical features in your daughter that might change what conditions we're considering? And sometimes the pattern in a family gives us information even when the laboratory doesn't give us a molecular diagnosis. It may not give us a neat answer, but it can help us decide what makes sense to consider next. And that brings me to another question I think families should feel comfortable asking after negative testing. Could this test become more informative later? Sometimes, yes. Genetics is one of those areas of medicine where an answer from 5 to 10 years ago may be worth revisiting. New genes are discovered, testing technology improves, variant classifications change, our understanding of conditions changes. So, if your child had genetic testing years ago and no explanation was identified, it may be reasonable to ask the genetics team whether there is any value in reviewing those results again or considering updated testing. That doesn't mean everyone with a negative test needs to repeat genetic testing every year. Absolutely not. But negative today doesn't necessarily mean there will never be an answer. And I think that can be a much more accurate and hopefully less discouraging way to understand it. Now, I also want to be careful about something here. Finding a genetic answer isn't inherently better than not finding one. There are families who desperately want an explanation. There are families who aren't particularly interested in knowing the genetic cause. And there are families somewhere in between. There are many valid reasons someone may choose genetic testing, and many valid reasons someone may not choose to pursue it. The role of healthcare professionals is to provide information and support, not to decide what a family should value. That's an important part of genetic counseling. My job isn't to convince you that you need a molecular explanation for your child's hearing. My job is to help you understand what testing could potentially tell you, what it can't tell you, and whether those answers would actually be useful to you. Because a genetic diagnosis doesn't determine your child's value. And a negative genetic test doesn't make your child's hearing difference any less real. It simply means that, with the tools and knowledge we have right now, we haven't identified a genetic explanation. So, if I could leave this parent with one thing, it would be this. Don't think of a negative genetic test as genetics closing the door. Think of it as, we looked with this particular test, using what science currently knows, and we didn't find the answer. Maybe there isn't a genetic answer. Maybe the answer exists, but our testing can't detect it yet. Maybe there's a gene we haven't discovered. Maybe the answer is more complicated than one gene. Or maybe revisiting the testing in the future will give us more information that we don't have today. And in the meantime, your child's healthcare doesn't stop while we wait for genetics to catch up. Audiology care can continue. Communication and educational support can continue. Your child's medical team can continue following the things that are relevant to your child, rather than a hypothetical genetic result. And your child can continue growing into exactly who they are. Genetics is one tool we can use to understand part of that story. Sometimes it gives us a beautifully clear answer. And sometimes the most accurate answer we can give is, we don't know yet. As a genetic counselor, I don't consider that a failure. I consider it an honest description of where the science is today, and an invitation to keep asking questions as the science moves forward. All right, let's take a look at our last question. Question 4 states, my child had genetic testing because of his hearing loss, and they found variants in 2 genes associated with other medical conditions, but both results are variants of uncertain significance. I'm scared about what this could mean for his future. Does a VUS mean he could develop those conditions? I'm really glad you asked this question because genetic test reports can be incredibly scary when you don't know how to interpret the language on them. You went into testing because your child has hearing loss, and then you get this report back. You see the names of 2 genes, you Google those genes, you find the medical conditions associated with them, and suddenly you're no longer thinking about the question you originally had. You're thinking, wait, does my baby have these conditions too? Are these things going to happen later? Did we just find something much more serious than the hearing loss? So I want to start with the most important thing. A variant of uncertain significance is not a diagnosis. And I really want to sit with that for a second because I think the wording on genetic reports can make that difficult to appreciate. A variant of uncertain significance, which you'll often see abbreviated as VUS, means that the laboratory found a difference in someone's DNA, but based on the evidence available right now, we don't know whether that difference affects the function of the gene in a way that would cause disease. That's the uncertainty. It isn't, we found a disease causing variant, but we don't know whether your child will develop symptoms. It's one step before that. We don't yet know whether this particular genetic change is disease causing at all. That's a really important distinction. The National Human Genome Research Institute describes a VUS similarly. It's a genetic variant where there currently isn't enough information to determine whether it's actually connected to a health condition. And I think understanding that changes how you read the rest of that report. Because let's imagine that one of those genes is associated with a condition that affects hearing and vision. You see the gene, you see the condition. Naturally, your eyes go directly to the section describing vision loss. But the fact that your child has a VUS and a gene associated with that condition doesn't mean that your child has been diagnosed with that condition. It also doesn't mean that vision loss is now a part of your child's expected future. The same is true if the other gene is associated with something involving the kidneys, the heart, the thyroid, or any part of the body. Finding a VUS in a gene is not the same thing as finding the condition associated with that gene. And this is one of those moments where I think knowing a little bit about how genetic testing works can actually make the result much less frightening. All of us have genetic variation. If I sequenced my DNA and compared it with yours, there would be lots and lots of places where our DNA is different, and that's normal. Those differences are part of what makes human beings genetically diverse. So when a laboratory analyzes a gene, the question isn't simply, did we find something different? Because of course we're going to find differences. The much more important question is, do we have enough evidence to know what this particular difference means? And laboratories use multiple categories to describe that evidence. At one end, you might see benign or likely benign. Those are variants where the evidence suggests that the change does not cause the condition. At the other end, you have pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants. Those are variants where there is enough evidence to support that the change is associated with disease. And then sitting in the middle is variant of uncertain significance. We found something. We just don't have enough evidence yet to confidently put it on either side. And importantly, professional guidelines specifically say that a VUS should not be used by itself to make clinical decisions. That's why, if I were sitting with this parent in a genetic counseling appointment, I would not look at those two VUS results and say, your child is at risk of developing these two conditions. I would say, let's figure out what these results actually tell us and what they don't. And this is where I'd want the actual genetic test report in front of me, because the gene name by itself is nowhere near enough information. I want to know the exact variant. I want to know the classification. I want to know the inheritance pattern of the condition associated with that gene. I want to know whether there was one variant or more than one. I want to know whether the laboratory thinks the gene has any reasonable relationship to your child's hearing loss. I want to know whether anything in your child's medical history actually resembles the condition associated with that gene. I want to look at the family history. And depending on the situation, I may want to know whether either parent has the same variant, because this is where genetics gets much more nuanced than gene equals disease. It doesn't work that way. Let's say, for example, that a condition is autosomal recessive. Usually, someone needs disease-causing variants affecting both copies of that gene to have the condition. If your child has one VUS in that gene, there are already two layers of uncertainty. First, we don't know whether that variant is disease-causing. And second, even if it eventually were shown to be disease-causing, depending on the condition and what else was found, one variant may simply indicate carrier status rather than mean that your child has the condition. On the other hand, if we're talking about an autosomal dominant condition, the interpretation is different. That's why I don't want someone looking up the gene and trying to infer their child's future from the list of conditions that appears in a search. The inheritance pattern matters. The exact variant matters. The classification matters. The child's clinical findings matter. The whole picture matters. And I think this is one of the places where genetic counselors can be particularly helpful. Because sometimes the most important thing I can do in an appointment isn't tell you what your result means, it's tell you what your result doesn't mean. You don't need to leave that appointment carrying every possible condition associated with every gene listed on the report as though your child has just been diagnosed with all of them. That's a tremendous amount of fear to carry based on information that may ultimately turn out to be not medically meaningful. And I think there's another really important question hidden inside what this parent just asked. They didn't just ask, "What is a VUS?" They asked, "What could this mean for his future?" And that this is a different question. Because I imagine what this parent really wants to know is, should I be watching my baby for these conditions now? Should he be getting additional testing? Is something going to show up when he's 5, 10, 20? And unfortunately, a VUS generally can't answer those questions. That's exactly why it's uncertain. If we don't know whether the variant causes disease, we can't use the variant itself to predict that person's medical future. That doesn't mean we ignore the child. It means we base care on the child rather than allowing an uncertain DNA finding to become a prediction. So, if your child has a medical finding that independently warrants evaluation, that should absolutely be evaluated. If there's something in the family history that raises concern, that's relevant. If your child's physicians see clinical features that make them suspicious for one of those conditions, independent of the VUS, that may warrant further evaluation. But that's very different from saying, there's a VUS in this gene, so we're going to assume your child has the condition. We don't want to do that. And this distinction is so important that updated ACMG guidance specifically discusses the potential harm that can occur when uncertain variants are mistakenly treated as casual and lead to inappropriate medical care. Now, sometimes we can gather more information about a VUS. One thing that may occasionally be helpful is family testing. Let's say the laboratory finds a VUS in your baby. Maybe we test parents and discover that the variant was inherited from a completely healthy parent who is much older and has none of the features we'd expect from a highly penetrant condition. Depending on the gene, the condition, and the inheritance pattern, that information may contribute evidence toward understanding the variant. Or perhaps we discover something about how the variant tracks with a particular feature across several relatives. Again, whether family testing is useful depends heavily on the specific variant and condition. So I wouldn't recommend that every family immediately go out and test everybody. Sometimes laboratories will specifically recommend family studies because they believe those results could help clarify the variant. Other times, testing relatives won't actually tell us very much. That's another great question to ask your genetic counselor. Would testing either parent or anyone else in our family actually help clarify either of those VUS results? And if the answer is no, that's okay too. Sometimes what we need isn't another test. We need more time and more scientific evidence. Maybe another laboratory sees the same variant. Maybe researchers study what the change does to the protein. Maybe it's eventually found in many healthy people. Maybe more people with the condition are identified and they consistently have that variant. All of those pieces of evidence can help, and it can help us understand whether a variant is more likely to be harmful or harmless. And as evidence accumulates, a VUS can sometimes be reclassified. It may eventually become likely benign or benign, or it may eventually become likely pathogenic or pathogenic. And sometimes it stays uncertain. That's one reason I think it's important to ask the genetics team, how will I know if this result gets reclassified? Some laboratories have systems for issuing amended reports, but policies vary, people move, clinicians change practices, and years can pass. ACMG guidance recommends that laboratories have processes for communicating meaningful changes in variant classification. And it also recognizes that reinterpretation may become appropriate as scientific knowledge and testing technology evolve. So I think it's reasonable to keep a copy of the original genetic test report, not just the after visit summary, not just a note saying genetic testing is inconclusive. Keep the actual laboratory report, because maybe several years from now, your child sees a genetic counselor again. Having that exact report means we can see precisely what was tested and precisely what was found. And there's another piece of VUS results that I think is really important to acknowledge. Uncertainty is emotionally hard. Sometimes people think receiving an uncertain result should be easier than receiving a diagnosis, but that isn't always true. For some parents, uncertainty is incredibly difficult because your brain wants to turn uncertainty into certainty. And again, we do that Google searching. You find the worst manifestation of the condition. Then you look at your child and think, is this what's waiting for him? And suddenly, you're living emotionally inside a future that the genetic test never actually predicted. That's why I would be really careful with internet searches after receiving a VUS. I'm not saying don't educate yourself. I love when families want to understand genetics. But if you search the gene, most of what you're going to find is information about people who have disease causing variants in that gene. That information may have very little to do with your child's uncertain variant. It's like finding an unfamiliar word in a book and then reading the summary of the entire book to figure out what that one word means. You're getting a lot of information, but it may not answer the question you're asking. Because genetic testing can sometimes produce uncertain or unexpected information, families deserve counseling about that possibility rather than simply being handed a result without context. This is exactly why pretest counseling matters. Before testing, ideally someone has explained we may find the answer, we may find nothing, and we may find something that we don't understand yet. Because all three are possible outcomes of genetic testing. But if nobody explained that beforehand, opening a report with two VUS findings can feel like someone has suddenly handed you two possible diagnoses, and that's not an accurate way to understand the result. So if this were a family sitting across from me, I think I'd actually take out a piece of paper and make 3 columns. What we know, what we don't know, and what we can do next. So what do we know? Your baby has hearing loss. We know the results of his audiologic evaluation. We know whatever else his physicians have observed about his health and development. And we know that genetic testing identified 2 variants that the laboratory currently does not have enough evidence to classify as either disease causing or benign. Now, what don't we know? We don't know whether either VUS affects gene function in a way that causes disease. And therefore, based on the VUS alone, we don't know that your baby has either of the conditions you're reading about. And what can we do next? We can have the report reviewed in the context of his medical and family history. We can ask whether parental testing would actually provide useful evidence. We can ask how the laboratory handles reclassification. We can keep the report available for future review. And most importantly, we can continue taking care of the child who is in front of us rather than trying to medically manage every possible future suggested by an uncertain laboratory finding. Your baby's future has not suddenly been rewritten because 2 gene names appeared on a laboratory report. You learned something about his DNA. Right now, science doesn't know whether those 2 particular findings are medically meaningful. That uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but uncertainty is not the same thing as bad news, and it's definitely not the same thing as a diagnosis. So if I could answer your question in one sentence, no. A VUS in a gene associated with a medical condition doesn't mean that your baby has that condition or that he's expected to develop it in the future. It means we found a genetic change whose significance we don't yet understand. And until we understand it better, we treat it like what it is, uncertain information, not a prediction of your child's future. And that's going to wrap up our questions for today. Thank you again so much to everyone who submitted questions for today's episode. I genuinely love getting to see what you're curious about because your questions are what shape this podcast. So if there's something about genetics you've always wondered, a genetic condition you'd like to understand better, a confusing genetic testing term you've come across, a question about genetic counseling, or just really anything genetics related, leave your questions in the comments below or reach out to me on Instagram, on YouTube, on Spotify, anywhere you find me. And you may just hear it answered in a future episode. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to All Things GC, and share the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it too. As always, everything we discuss here is for educational purposes only, and it isn't a substitute for individualized medical care or genetic counseling. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Ask a Genetic Counselor.
Got questions about your genes or your DNA? Let's find the answers. Ask a genetic counselor.